You know that sudden, suffocating feeling when the floor completely drops out beneath you? Like the air gets sucked right out of your lungs and your ears start ringing so loud you can hear your own heart hammering against your ribs? That was the precise moment Brenda Thorne from Human Resources slid a crisp white sheet of paper across her cheap laminate desk. A 65% salary reduction, effective immediately. I sat there in that air-conditioned glass box, staring at the bold black numbers printed on the page, waiting for someone to jump out and tell me it was a sick joke. 65%. My annual compensation was being dragged down from $175,000 a year to $61,250. I did not yell. I did not punch the wall. I did not break down in tears. Instead, I swallowed the bitter lump in my throat, forced a calm, measured smile onto my face, and looked straight into Brenda's cold eyes. I told her I would need 24 hours to evaluate the revised offer, speaking in a steady, robotic tone as if I had not just been stabbed in the chest. The emotional collapse waited until I reached my truck parked on the third level of the concrete garage. I locked the doors, buried my face in my hands, and let out heavy, ragged sobs that fogged up the windshield. I sat there for nearly 45 minutes, completely overwhelmed by the sheer betrayal. How does a corporate enterprise where you spent 10 full years of your life, working through weekends and missing countless family dinners, decide overnight that your decade of dedication is worth less than half of what you earned yesterday? Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Daniel Vance, though most people in the industry call me Dan. I am 49 years old, a single father raising a brilliant 12-year-old boy named Gavin. Up until that soul-crushing corporate meeting, I served as the Senior Director of Client Enterprise Solutions at Kestrel Data. It has been 3 long years since that day, but talking about it still makes my chest tighten. When I first joined Kestrel Data 10 years ago, we were a scrappy, ambitious technology startup operating out of a renovated brick warehouse in downtown Chicago. There were only 12 of us back then. We worked absurd hours, survived on cold takeout pizza, and shared a genuine belief that we were building something truly revolutionary. I started as a senior client account specialist, but I threw my entire soul into the work. I logged 75 hours every week, streamlined complex data integration architectures, and personally cultivated our top corporate accounts from scratch. Within 4 years, I was managing 8 major corporate accounts that collectively generated over 74% of Kestrel Data's entire annual recurring revenue. I did not just manage spreadsheets. I understood their underlying software ecosystems, anticipated their operational bottlenecks, remembered their executive board milestones, and knew their key engineering directors by name. These were not merely corporate accounts to me. They were deep, trust-based professional relationships built over years of flawless technical execution. When Gavin's mother, Chloe, decided 6 years ago that family life and domestic responsibility were hindering her personal growth, she packed her bags and relocated to San Diego with a personal fitness trainer. From that moment on, I became the sole provider and emotional foundation for my son. Gavin manages severe chronic respiratory allergies and asthma, requiring specialized medical treatments, continuous pulmonary testing, and costly prescription regimens. Those client relationships and my executive salary were not just my career. They were my lifeline, my son's health insurance, and the sole security protecting our family home mortgage. By my 7th year at the company, I was promoted to senior director. I led a dedicated team of 10 software specialists and account managers. I held equity options and earned a comfortable salary that meant I never had to choose between paying our monthly mortgage and funding Gavin's specialized medical care. For the first time since my divorce, I felt stable, accomplished, and secure. Then came the corporate acquisition. Omnicorp Global, a massive conglomerate known for aggressive asset consolidation, bought Kestrel Data 2 years ago. I can still recall the mandatory company meeting. Elliot Fairchild, our original founder, stood on the cafeteria stage, telling us how prosperous this merger would be and how Omnicorp's vast capital would scale our vision nationwide. Everyone clapped while I noticed Elliot avoiding eye contact with the core team. We later discovered Elliot walked away with $4,500,000 in cash and fully vested equity while the rest of us had our stock converted into long-term corporate options tied to a rigid 4-year vesting timeline under restrictive new terms. For the first 6 months after the merger, the changes appeared manageable. We received new corporate branding, upgraded email signatures, and extra administrative oversight, but my core team remained intact. Then the corporate restructuring began. First, Omnicorp terminated junior developers, then middle management, sending out vague corporate memos about streamlining operational synergies and maximizing shareholder returns. My team was gutted from 10 specialists down to 3, yet our client workload expanded dramatically. I found myself answering urgent client emails at 3 in the morning and enduring intense physical stress. Gavin began asking why I was constantly glued to my laptop during his weekend soccer matches and why I looked perpetually exhausted. Yet, I convinced myself I was indispensable because I personally held the client accounts driving the majority of our revenue. That naive belief shattered when Brenda Thorne scheduled a sudden 15-minute touchpoint. When I walked into the conference room, Lyle Stanhope, Omnicorp's corporate restructuring vice president, was sitting beside her, wearing a tailored suit and a condescending smile. He informed me that corporate was realigning compensation to match updated market benchmarks, while Brenda pushed the pay cut paper toward me. They knew I was a single father relying on enterprise health benefits. They knew about my mortgage. It was not a negotiation. It was a deliberate, constructive discharge designed to force me to resign without severance. I maintained composure, requested 24 hours to review the structural transition, and walked out of the room with absolute quiet dignity. I remember walking back to my executive desk in a total daze, packing my personal laptop, and driving out of the parking structure into the afternoon traffic. Sitting in my truck, my mind raced through every financial obligation holding my household together. Gavin's monthly pulmonary treatments, our home mortgage, private tutoring, utilities, grocery bills, and daily living expenses. How could I look my 12-year-old son in the eye and explain that 10 years of executive service had been wiped out by corporate greed in a 15-minute meeting? That was when my smartphone buzzed loudly on the dashboard. The caller identification displayed a name I had not seen in several months, Nora Albright. Nora was a brilliant former senior strategist at Kestrel Data who had resigned 8 months earlier after clashing with Omnicorp's invasive corporate policies and toxic executive management. I swallowed my pride, took a breath, and answered the call. Nora's voice was warm, confident, and energetic. She explained that she had taken a senior executive role at Vanguard Technologies, Omnicorp's chief corporate competitor in the enterprise data sector. She mentioned that her executive leadership team had been quietly keeping track of my client success track record for over 2 years. Vanguard Technologies had repeatedly tried to secure enterprise contracts with Zenith Financial and Summit Logistics, but both major corporations had consistently renewed with Kestrel Data solely because of my personal oversight, strategic vision, and technical execution. Nora asked if I would be willing to sit down for an informal breakfast meeting with Vanguard's chief executive officer, Grant Kingsley. I looked back at the cold glass facade of the Omnicorp building through my windshield. I thought about Lyle Stanhope's arrogant smile and Brenda Thorne's mechanical indifference. I thought about Elliot Fairchild sailing away on his $4,500,000 payout while the remaining staff were treated as disposable line items. I told Nora that meeting the following morning would be ideal. When I arrived home that evening, I paid Gavin's after-school caregiver, spent a quiet hour listening to my son recount his middle school science project, and tucked him into bed. Once he was fast asleep, I retreated to my home office, pulled out my desk lamp, and opened my original employment records from Kestrel Data. As a senior executive, I wanted to understand my precise legal standing before taking any definitive action. I carefully reviewed my initial employment agreement signed 10 years ago with Kestrel Data. What I discovered was a monumental legal oversight on Omnicorp's part. When Elliot Fairchild originally founded Kestrel Data, he operated on an open culture philosophy and deliberately omitted non-compete covenants from executive employment contracts, believing that mutual respect was far superior to legal coercion. When Omnicorp acquired Kestrel Data 2 years ago, their legal department issued standardized non-compete agreements to newly hired employees. But in their bureaucratic haste, they completely failed to execute updated employment contracts for legacy senior executives like myself. My legacy contract remained fully governing and unamended. Furthermore, my original agreement contained a specific protective clause drafted years ago following an internal corporate dispute. Any unilateral reduction in base compensation exceeding 15% automatically constituted a material breach of contract by the employer, immediately waiving all employee advance notice periods and post-employment transition obligations. Omnicorp's aggressive 65% pay cut had legally severed my contractual obligations overnight, freeing me from all transition requirements. At 9:30 that evening, I called Nora Albright back. She immediately connected me with Grant Kingsley, the Chief Executive Officer of Vanguard Technologies. Grant was direct, highly articulate, deeply knowledgeable, and entirely devoid of corporate posturing. He explained that Vanguard had been actively monitoring Omnicorp's post-merger missteps and recognized that Kestrel Data's client satisfaction was plummeting due to corporate overhead. Grant proposed meeting at 7:30 the next morning at a quiet diner located 5 miles west of the financial district, well away from both corporate headquarters. I barely slept that night. I lay awake analyzing the legal, financial, and ethical ramifications of what I was about to do. Was it disloyal to leave the company I had helped build from 12 people? But Kestrel Data no longer existed in spirit. It had been cannibalized by Omnicorp Global, a corporate machine that viewed dedicated employees as cost burdens to be eliminated without a second thought. I spent the quiet hours before dawn organizing my personal client records. I did not copy proprietary source code or confidential company trade secrets. Instead, I compiled my personal professional notes, built over a decade of hands-on leadership, personal contact preferences for corporate decision-makers, direct cell numbers of chief technology officers, specific system integration timelines, and key pain points caused by Omnicorp's recent service delays. This was unencumbered professional knowledge and personal rapport that I had earned through years of dedicated service. By 6 in the morning, I felt a deep sense of absolute clarity and purpose. I dressed in my sharpest Navy executive suit, tied my silk necktie, and gave Gavin an extra tight hug before dropping him off at school. Gavin looked at me with his perceptive hazel eyes and asked if everything was all right. I looked at my son, smiled with genuine confidence for the first time in months, and told him that his father was taking back control of our lives. The oak-paneled booth at the Westside Executive Diner was quiet, warm, and private at 7:30 in the morning. Grant Kingsley was already seated alongside Nora Albright when I walked in. Grant stood immediately, extended a firm handshake, and expressed sincere respect for my decade of work at Kestrel Data. He stated candidly that Vanguard Technologies had attempted to compete against my client accounts for 5 consecutive years, but every chief technology officer in the region had remained fiercely loyal to Kestrel Data because of my personal technical integrity and responsive leadership. Grant opened a leather-bound folder and placed a formal executive offer letter on the table. The position offered was Senior Vice President of Enterprise Client Solutions at Vanguard Technologies. The financial compensation package was extraordinary, a base salary of $225,000 per year, a 30% annual performance bonus structure, a $35,000 cash signing bonus, full equity options vesting over 3 years, and elite-tier family medical coverage that would cover Gavin's specialized pulmonary treatments without out-of-pocket costs. I stared at the figures on the parchment. The base compensation was $50,000 higher than what I had earned at peak level with Kestrel Data, and nearly 4 times the reduced $61,250 figure that Lyle Stanhope and Brenda Thorne had tried to force upon me. When I asked Grant why Vanguard was offering such substantial compensation, he did not hesitate. He explained that internal market analysis demonstrated that my primary accounts maintained a 94% client retention rate over a 10-year span, compared to the technology industry benchmark of 71%. Grant emphasized that in enterprise data systems, client trust is not an abstract corporate asset. It is tied directly to the executive who delivers on promises. Vanguard recognized me as a major strategic asset, whereas Omnicorp viewed me as an expensive line item. Nora Albright then shared critical internal intelligence regarding Omnicorp's true operational motives. Through her network of industry contacts, she had learned that Omnicorp's restructuring vice president, Lyle Stanhope, was implementing a pre-planned corporate playbook. Omnicorp was secretly preparing to transfer all technical client management and software support operations to low-cost overseas call centers within 8 months. Lyle Stanhope was deliberately imposing 50 to 65% salary cuts on legacy senior directors to provoke voluntary resignations, effectively carrying out constructive discharge to evade paying mandatory corporate severance under federal employment laws. Under Title 29 of the United States Code, Section 2101, commonly known as the Worker Adjustment and Retraining Notification Act, or the WARN Act, major employers are legally mandated to provide 60 days advance written notice prior to mass layoffs or plant closings. By orchestrating hostile pay cuts, Lyle Stanhope was attempting to bypass federal WARN Act compliance and deprive long-standing employees of their earned benefits while forcing them to train offshore replacements before being terminated. Hearing this revealed the full extent of Omnicorp's corporate cynicism. They were not merely reducing my compensation. They were planning to eliminate my position entirely within 8 months after sucking every drop of client knowledge out of me. I looked Grant Kingsley directly in the eye, accepted his pen, and signed the executive employment contract with Vanguard Technologies on the spot. We agreed that I would officially assume my new executive role on Monday morning. At 10:30 that same morning, I walked back into Omnicorp Global's regional headquarters carrying my leather briefcase. A signed Vanguard employment agreement secured inside, and absolute legal clarity in my mind. Brenda Thorne and Lyle Stanhope were waiting in the main executive conference room. Lyle was checking his gold wristwatch with an expression of mild annoyance, while Brenda sat with an open personnel folder. Lyle did not bother to stand or offer a greeting. He casually asked if I was ready to execute the revised compensation paperwork so they could finalize the department's quarterly budget restructuring. I sat down across from them, placed my hands flat on the polished mahogany table, and maintained a serene, unshakable composure. Before discussing any paperwork, I asked Lyle to clarify who would be managing the upcoming multi-million-dollar software deployment for Zenith Financial next month, as well as the annual enterprise contract renewal for Summit Logistics in June. Lyle dismissed my question with an arrogant wave of his hand, stating that internal resource allocation was executive business and that my responsibility was simply to accept the revised salary tier and execute a smooth operational handover to their incoming corporate transition team. I looked directly at Lyle and asked him point-blank if Omnicorp was planning to shift all client technical services to overseas centers within 8 months. The color drained out of Lyle's face almost instantly. Brenda Thorne stiffened in her chair and stared intently at her notepad. Lyle demanded to know where I had acquired such unauthorized corporate information. I replied that corporate actions speak louder than executive euphemisms, and that attempting to execute constructive discharge to bypass federal WARN Act notifications was both legally reckless and ethically bankrupt. Lyle's jaw tightened as he snapped that the meeting was strictly about my current employment election. Accept the 65% salary reduction or vacate the premises immediately. I took a deep, deliberate breath, thought of Gavin's smiling face, thought of 10 years of my life, poured into building enterprise client trust, and looked straight into Lyle Stanhope's eyes. I told him calmly that I was rejecting the revised compensation offer and that I was tendering my immediate resignation from Omnicorp Global effective that very minute. Lyle blinked in disbelief, then sneered arrogantly, stating that corporate executive policy required all senior directors to provide a mandatory 30-day written notice and complete a comprehensive transition of all assigned client accounts before departing. I opened my briefcase, pulled out a copy of my original employment agreement with Kestrel Data, and pushed it across the table. I pointed out the specific legal clause establishing that any unilateral reduction in compensation exceeding 15% constituted an immediate material breach of contract by the company, completely nullifying all advance notice requirements and post-employment transition duties. I informed Lyle that because Omnicorp had unilaterally slashed my salary by 65%, my contractual obligation to provide notice had been legally dissolved. Lyle's face flushed a deep shade of crimson as he sputtered that I was still bound by corporate non-compete agreements and trade secret protections. I looked him dead in the eye and reminded him that Elliot Fairchild had never included non-competes in legacy Kestrel data contracts, and that Omnicorp's legal team had failed to execute new agreements with legacy executives following the acquisition. I formally notified him that I had accepted a senior vice president position with Vanguard Technologies and would begin leading their enterprise client division on Monday morning. Lyle slammed his hand on the mahogany table, his voice rising in anger as he threatened to unleash Omnicorp's legal department, file immediate injunctions, and bury me in federal litigation for trade secret misappropriation and client poaching. I stood up slowly, adjusted my jacket, and addressed Lyle with absolute legal precision. I reminded him of federal intellectual property principles under Title 17 of the United States Code, Section 106, as well as established state common law doctrines regarding breach of fiduciary duty. I made it crystal clear that I had taken zero corporate code, zero proprietary files, and zero confidential trade secrets. However, the professional trust, technical expertise, and personal relationships I had cultivated with corporate executives over a decade belonged to me, not to Omnicorp, and those unencumbered assets walked out the door with me. I turned and walked out of the conference room, while Lyle Stanhope continued to splutter threats into the empty air. I walked back to my desk to retrieve my personal belongings. My 3 remaining team members looked up with anxious expressions. They had all heard whispers of the corporate restructuring. I leaned over and quietly advised them to check their personal emails. Later that evening, assuring them that better opportunities lay ahead, I packed my framed photograph of Gavin, my personal desktop items, my son's emergency inhaler, and my favorite coffee mug into a single cardboard box. Security guards were summoned to escort me to the lobby, a standard corporate intimidation tactic reserved for departing executives. I walked out of the glass building with my head held high, feeling zero regret, zero fear, and absolute liberation. The moment I reached my truck, I initiated 3 crucial phone calls. My first call was to Valerie Cross, the formidable Chief Technology Officer at Zenith Financial, our largest enterprise account. Valerie was a sharp, no-nonsense executive who had worked directly with me for 6 years. I informed Valerie that I had officially departed Omnicorp Global due to fundamental corporate restructuring and had joined Vanguard Technologies as Senior Vice President. Valerie did not hide her alarm. She revealed that Zenith Financial had already been experiencing significant performance delays under Omnicorp's new management, and that their upcoming multi-million-dollar software integration was contractually contingent on my personal executive oversight. Valerie stated flatly that if Omnicorp was removing me from their account, Zenith Financial would immediately exercise their contractual termination clause for convenience and transition their entire enterprise account to Vanguard Technologies under my leadership. My second call was to Malcolm Rhodes, Chief Information Officer at Summit Logistics. Malcolm reacted with equal outrage upon learning that Omnicorp had attempted to demote me while planning to shift technical support overseas. He informed me that Summit Logistics would not permit their critical data infrastructure to be managed by offshore contractors, and confirmed that Summit Logistics would initiate an immediate vendor migration to Vanguard Technologies. Combined, Zenith Financial and Summit Logistics represented over $28 million in annual recurring contract value. My third call was to my son. When I told Gavin I was picking him up early from school and taking him out for ice cream to celebrate my new job, his joyful laughter filled the phone line. For the first time in years, the crushing weight of corporate anxiety lifted entirely from my shoulders. By 7 o'clock that evening, while Gavin and I were sitting at our kitchen table working on his middle school science presentation. My personal phone rang with an unrecognized corporate number, I answered calmly. The voice on the line was grave, authoritative, deeply concerned, and visibly strained. It was Gerald Thornton, the chief executive officer and chairman of Omnicorp Global, calling me directly from corporate headquarters in New York. Gerald Thornton skipped the pleasantries. He stated that he had spent the past 3 hours receiving frantic emergency calls from Valerie Cross at Zenith Financial and Malcolm Rhodes at Summit Logistics. Both enterprise clients had formally submitted legal notices of contract cancellation, citing material breach of service, continuity, and loss of key executive leadership. Together, those two cancellations wiped out $28 million in annual recurring revenue from Omnicorp's technology division. Gerald Thornton admitted that Elliot Fairchild had called him personally to express disgust over how legacy executives were being treated, and that internal audits revealed Lyle Stanhope and Brenda Thorne had executed unauthorized compensation slashes to artificially inflate quarterly operating margins. Gerald Thornton then made a desperate executive pitch. He offered to immediately reinstate my senior director position at Kestrel Data, match Vanguard's $225,000 base salary, grant a $100,000 cash retention bonus, and fire Lyle Stanhope immediately if I agreed to return and salvage the $28 million client accounts. I listened quietly to the chief executive officer of a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate begging me to save his division. Then I let out a soft, measured laugh. I told Gerald Thornton that his offer came 3 days too late. I explained that business leadership is ultimately built on mutual respect and integrity, not panic-driven damage control when executive incompetence suddenly carries a $28 million price tag. I informed Gerald Thornton that I would not be returning to Omnicorp under any circumstances. However, I offered him a clear executive warning. If Omnicorp attempted to file frivolous retaliatory lawsuits against me or harass my new employer, I would immediately retain top federal labor counsel to expose Lyle Stanhope's systemic Warren Act violations and constructive discharge practices in open court. Gerald Thornton went silent for a long moment, then quietly promised that no legal action would ever be taken against me, and assured me that internal corporate reviews would commence immediately. 3 days later, I officially walked into Vanguard Technologies as Senior Vice President of Enterprise Client Solutions. They provided me with a corner executive office overlooking the Chicago skyline, a dedicated engineering team, and absolute operational autonomy. Within 2 weeks of my arrival, Zenith Financial officially signed an exclusive multi-year enterprise contract with Vanguard Technologies, transferring their entire data platform under my division's care. 1 month later, Summit Logistics followed suit, migrating their entire logistics network to Vanguard. Within 6 months, 3 additional major corporate accounts that I had built over the past decade left Omnicorp and transitioned to Vanguard Technologies. Omnicorp Global suffered a catastrophic financial blow in their regional data division. Lyle Stanhope was quietly terminated for executive misconduct and failure of oversight, while Brenda Thorne was reassigned to a subordinate human resources role before leaving the firm entirely. Omnicorp was forced to abandon their offshore migration strategy altogether. Though the reputational damage had already been done, it has now been 3 full years since the day Brenda Thorne slid that pay-cut paper across her desk. Today, I lead an elite team of 22 software architects and client solution directors at Vanguard Technologies. My financial compensation has reached levels I once thought impossible, providing complete financial security for my family. More importantly, my life is completely transformed. I no longer answer frantic corporate emails at 3 in the morning. I am home every single evening to eat dinner with Gavin. I have not missed a single one of my son's soccer matches, parent-teacher conferences, or science fair competitions in 3 years. Gavin's pulmonary health has stabilized remarkably under elite medical care, and our home is filled with laughter and peace. Last month, at a national technology conference in Chicago, I happened to spot Elliot Fairchild across the convention hall. He walked over, shook my hand warmly, and admitted with genuine regret that selling Kestrel data to Omnicorp without protecting his legacy team was the biggest moral mistake of his career. He looked at me with sincere pride and stated that leaving Omnicorp was the finest executive move I could have ever executed. Looking back on that cold morning in the HR conference room, I realized that the 65% pay cut was not the end of my career. It was the catalyst that forced me to recognize my true professional worth. Corporate executives often count on employees being paralyzed by fear, believing that we are helpless against their legal departments and executive authority. But true leverage does not belong to corporate titles or massive bureaucracies. It belongs to the individual who masters their craft, earns unencumbered client trust, and understands their legal rights. Their legal rights, the ultimate revenge against corporate injustice, was not the $28 million in contracts that followed me to Vanguard, nor was it watching Lyle Stanhope get ousted in disgrace. The ultimate revenge was discovering my own unshakable self-worth, standing firm in the face of corporate intimidation, and building a prosperous, joyful life for my son and myself. Sometimes, all it takes is one decisive phone call to reclaim your dignity, transform your destiny, and prove that you are worth far more than they ever dared to estimate.